I never imagined that a single question could unravel years of betrayal in front of an entire dinner table. That Christmas Eve, I sat quietly tucked into the corner of a beautifully set dining room table, pretending to be part of a family that had never truly accepted me. Then my grandfather, who I hadn't seen in years, walked in smiling warmly and said something that made my blood run cold. "Did you like the house I gave you 2 years ago?" I froze. The room fell completely silent. My mind raced. What house I was still living in, a rundown apartment working night shifts just to survive. I looked at him stunned. "I never received any house," I replied. That's when it happened. My grandfather slowly turned to my father and stepmother. Their faces went pale. Their eyes darted in panic. And within seconds, all hell broke loose. But that was only the beginning. What followed was a shocking web of lies, stolen money, and a betrayal so deep it shook the foundation of everything I thought I knew about family. For years they pretended I didn't matter until the truth exploded right in front of them. If you think you've heard family drama before, trust me, this is different. Stay with me until the end, because when you find out what my grandfather did next, you'll realize justice may be delayed. But when it arrives, it changes everything. Elena Foster was 26 years old, living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of downtown Columbus, Ohio. She worked part-time at a local bookstore and tutored high school students in math during the evenings to make ends meet. Life had never handed her anything easily, but she'd grown used to surviving on her own. What she lacked in comfort she made up for in quiet strength and perseverance. Her world was small, orderly, and carefully guarded, built on the understanding that family, at least the one she was born into, had long since stopped being a safe place. It had been nearly a year since she'd last heard from her father, Gregory. Their communication had always been strained, but in recent years it had dwindled to nothing more than stiff holiday cards and the occasional passive-aggressive voicemail. So when she received a text from Cody, her half-brother and Linda's golden boy, just days before Christmas, she was skeptical. The message was short and strange. "Grandpa is here. You should come." That was it. No greeting, no context. Elena had stared at the screen thumb hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond or ignore it. She had every reason to ignore it. She was preparing for a major scholarship interview scheduled the next morning. It was an opportunity she had been working toward for months, a rare break she couldn't afford to miss. But something about the message unsettled her. Her grandfather, Walter Blake, wasn't the type to visit unannounced. In fact, she hadn't seen him since she was a teenager. His sudden appearance and the fact that Cody had bothered to contact her at all felt unusual enough to push her to reconsider. Maybe for once this Christmas dinner would be different. Maybe there was something more behind the invitation. Elena arrived just as the sun was setting, walking up to the unfamiliar house in a neighborhood she didn't recognize. She had no idea her family had moved. No one told her about the new address or the change in lifestyle. The house was large and well-kept, the kind of home that suggested money, something her family had always claimed they didn't have when she needed help. She hesitated at the door, clutching a small tin of homemade cookies. It was all she could afford to bring, and even that felt like a stretch. Inside, the warmth and noise hit her all at once. Christmas music played softly from the speakers, laughter echoed from the dining room, and the scent of roasted ham filled the air. But despite the cheer, Elena quickly realized that she didn't belong. Linda gave her a strained smile before disappearing into the kitchen. Cody offered a half-hearted wave from the couch, barely glancing up from his phone. No one offered to take her coat. No one asked how she had been. She stood awkwardly in the hallway for a full minute before finally placing her cookies on the side table and making her way to the dining room on her own. There were name cards at each place setting. Elena's name was missing. She sat at the far end of the table in a folding chair clearly added at the last minute. No one seemed to notice. Gregory was at the head of the table holding court, as always chatting with Linda's cousins about market trends and property taxes. Walter sat quietly beside him, looking older than she remembered, but still sharp, his posture straight, his eyes alert. He hadn't noticed Elena yet. Or maybe he had, and he was simply observing. Dinner began without much acknowledgement of her presence. Conversation swirled around her but rarely included her. She pushed the food around on her plate, smiled politely when someone looked her way, and kept her eyes down. Halfway through the meal, during a lull in conversation, Walter finally turned toward her. His voice was warm, curious. "Elena," he said, as if just now realizing she was there. "Do you like the house I gave you 2 years ago?" Forks paused mid-air. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The room fell completely silent. Elena looked up, startled. "What house?" she asked. Walter's brow furrowed. "The one I gave your father for you. 2 years ago. I thought you were living here." The silence grew heavy. All eyes turned to Gregory and Linda, who had gone visibly pale. Linda reached for her glass of wine with trembling fingers. Gregory cleared his throat, but said nothing. "I never received a house," Elena said slowly, her voice steady but cold. "I live in a rental apartment on 12th and Maple." Walter blinked, clearly confused. "But He stopped looking at Gregory now. "I wired the funds directly to you. You sent photos. You told me she was settled in, happy. I was told this was her home." No one spoke. Elena could feel the heat rising to her face, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Anger, betrayal, a terrible clarity settling into place. She looked around the table, saw how no one dared meet her eyes. And in that silence she knew. Something had been taken from her. Something she was never supposed to know about. But now she did. And things would never be the same again. Elena's mind buzzed as the dining room settled into a heavy silence. Her grandfather's unexpected question had cracked open something that had been buried for years, and the air seemed thick with a truth waiting to be uncovered. But as Gregory and Linda shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, trying to change the subject with forced smiles and stilted laughter, Elena's thoughts drifted far away from the dining room. Back to where everything began. To the day she was born and the mother she never got to know. Diana Foster had been 28 when she gave birth to Elena. By all accounts, she had been gentle, intelligent, and idealistic. A teacher who loved poetry and kept journals filled with dreams and recipes she hoped to one day share with her daughter. But those dreams ended in a cold hospital room on a rainy autumn morning. Complications during childbirth stole Diana's life just hours after Elena's first breath. Her grandfather, Walter, had been away in Europe for business at the time. By the time he returned, the funeral was over, and Gregory, Elena's father, was a different man. Grief didn't soften Gregory. It hardened him. The man who had once brought Diana flowers every Sunday became cold, withdrawn. He held Elena, but only when others were watching. He fed her, changed her, but with the distant obligation of a man fulfilling a duty, not raising a daughter. By the time Elena could speak, she understood something was wrong. She was surrounded by silence, not warmth. When she was 3, everything shifted again. Gregory remarried. Linda, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that never rose above a polite tone, moved into the house and brought with her a polished smile that never quite reached Elena. From the start, Linda treated her like an unwelcome relic of Gregory's first marriage. She didn't hit her, didn't shout, but every interaction carried the cold sting of dismissal. "You're such a serious child," Linda would say with a tight-lipped smile. "Not like Cody. He'll light up a room." Cody arrived when Elena was 5. The baby was celebrated like royalty. A nursery was painted blue and yellow, filled with plush toys and brand new clothes. Guests came bearing gifts, and Linda beamed like a queen. Elena watched it all from the hallway unnoticed, holding the same ragged teddy bear her mother had once bought on a schoolteacher's salary. That Christmas, Cody received a wooden rocking horse and a motorized train set. Elena was handed a wrapped box containing a second-hand puzzle pieces already missing. Gregory had said nothing. Linda had shrugged. "She won't notice," she'd muttered. The years blurred together after that, but the pattern never changed. Cody was the golden child. Elena was the afterthought. Her birthdays passed with generic cards or sometimes not at all. When she brought home a certificate for academic achievement in 4th grade, Gregory nodded once and turned back to his newspaper. When Cody got a participation ribbon for a t-ball game, the family went out for ice cream. There were moments Elena tried to push through the wall of indifference. Once in middle school, she baked a pie for Thanksgiving and placed it proudly on the table. Linda took one bite, winced, and quietly replaced it with a store-bought version. Cody laughed. Elena didn't bake again. Words cut deeper than silence. "Girls will be girls," Linda often said when Elena tried to ask for new shoes or to go on a field trip. But Cody, he's the future. He needs the best. That sentence, "he's the future," etched itself into Elena's memory. It became the refrain of her childhood, the mantra of her unworthiness. While Cody was signed up for music lessons, baseball, and a summer tech camp, Elena was told to help around the house and not to expect more. "Don't think life owes you anything just because you're a girl," Linda had told her once while folding laundry. "Cody will have to provide one day. You'll marry someone who can." At first, Elena tried to believe this was normal, that maybe all families were like this, that perhaps she just had to work harder, smile more, do better. But slowly, quietly, the realization dawned she was never going to be enough in their eyes. Not because she lacked talent or love, but because she simply wasn't Cody. By high school, Elena stopped asking. She learned to hide her report cards to quietly save the money she earned babysitting and tutoring other students. When her classmates talked about their parents helping with college visits, Elena stayed quiet. When they posted family photos online from birthday dinners or holiday trips, Elena scrolled past quickly, pretending it didn't sting. She lived in the attic room, small and cold, with a slanted ceiling and a drafty window that looked out over the backyard fence. Cody's room, by contrast, was on the main floor, sunny, spacious, freshly painted in his favorite colors. It was filled with things that reflected a life being built, supported. Elena's room felt like storage. And yet she never complained, not out loud. She had learned that speaking up would only bring colder stares and more hurtful words. So instead, she turned inward. Books became her solace. She read every night until the words blurred. She dreamed of one day leaving. Not in rebellion, but simply in quiet survival. The night before her high school graduation, Elena stood by the kitchen doorway, unsure whether to tell Gregory about her acceptance into a competitive university program. Cody had just received a smartwatch as a graduation gift from middle school. Linda was beaming, filming him with her phone. Elena looked at the acceptance letter in her hand. Then she folded it, tucked it back in the envelope, and went upstairs. Now, sitting at that dinner table 2 years later across from her father and the woman who had spent her whole life minimizing her presence, Elena realized something: she had become a stranger to them by design. Not because she chose distance, but because she had been pushed to the edges, one subtle rejection at a time. The question about the house, the one her grandfather thought he had given her, was not just a question about property. It was a question about worth, about love, about whether anyone had ever truly seen her. And as the silence in the dining room deepened, Elena understood. Her family hadn't just forgotten to give her what was hers. They had erased her from the picture entirely. Elena's earliest memories of school weren't of the playground or cafeteria lunches, they were of report cards. Neat rows of A's, perfect attendance, blue ribbons from spelling bees and science fairs. While other children ran to their parents waving certificates with glee, Elena learned to quietly slide her achievements into her backpack. At home, there were no fridge magnets holding up her awards, no celebratory dinners, not even a simple, "I'm proud of you." In the Foster household, silence met her success. She remembered one winter afternoon when she'd come home clutching a state-level award for mathematics. Her fingers were red from the cold, her shoes soaked through with slush, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. She placed the certificate on the dining table where Gregory sat sipping coffee and reading the paper. "I won first place, Dad." "It was statewide," she said softly. He glanced at the paper, barely lifting his eyes. "Don't get complacent. There's always someone better." That same week, Cody brought home a project he barely completed, a sloppy collage that Linda clearly helped him with. Gregory beamed. "Good job, son. You're improving." Linda clapped and said it was creative. They hung it on the wall in the hallway beside Cody's soccer photos and birthday snapshots. Elena's award. It disappeared into a drawer forgotten. She was taught early that Cody's mediocrity deserved applause, while her excellence was simply expected. Linda was the voice of this imbalance. "Elena, girls don't need to overdo it," she'd say while folding laundry. "You'll get married someday. Cody is the one we need to invest in." Sometimes when Elena dared to ask why Cody got new clothes and she wore hand-me-downs, Linda would pat her hand and say, "Be humble, darling. Life isn't fair for everyone. Know your place." The worst part was how normal it all became. Elena learned not to argue. She didn't cry or protest. She stopped asking for birthday parties for a new backpack for someone to attend parent-teacher night. When Linda told her, "Don't be difficult," she began to believe that being quiet was the only way to be accepted. In school, she was known as the quiet girl in the back of the class, the one who never asked questions out loud but aced every exam. Teachers praised her discipline. Classmates admired her from afar, but Elena never invited them over, never talked about home. She built walls around her spirit, and inside those walls, she stored all the dreams she never said out loud. The foster household wasn't loud or abusive. It was polite, cold, structured. And in that coldness, Elena learned to disappear. At mealtimes, Cody always got the first serving. He spoke loudly, joked, interrupted their father mid-sentence. No one minded. When Elena offered an opinion, Gregory would hold up a hand without looking at her. Let Cody finish. And he never circled back to her thoughts. It wasn't just material things, it was attention, validation, humanity. Even the air seemed different around Cody, lighter, easier. Elena's space was heavy, weighed down by Linda's subtle sighs, Gregory's disinterest, and Cody's smug sense of superiority. Elena once overheard Linda say on the phone, "Raising a girl is different. You raise them to leave. Boys stay. Boys carry the family name." It didn't matter to them that Elena bore Diana's name, the woman they barely mentioned anymore. And yet, despite the emotional drought, Elena didn't grow bitter. She grew determined. She wasn't born to please them. She was born to leave them. Every dollar she earned tutoring classmates she saved. Every hour she studied, she imagined the key it would become to unlock the front door and never return. She watched college application videos at night while Cody played video games. She memorized scholarship deadlines. She practiced interviews in front of a mirror, her voice growing steadier with each attempt. There was no room for rebellion, no dramatic teenage breakdown. Elena's quietness was her rebellion. She didn't fight to be seen. She trained herself to escape. She became her own compass in a house where the needle was always pointed toward Cody. If love was not given, she would live without it. But freedom, that was something she would earn. Education became her sanctuary. At school, there were teachers who noticed. Mrs. Kendrick, her literature teacher, once pulled her aside and said, "You have something most kids your age don't, Elena. Purpose. Don't lose it no matter what." Elena clung to those words like a lifeline. By 16, she had built a detailed plan for leaving. She would apply to universities far from Ohio. She would live in the cheapest dorms, eat whatever was on sale, work part-time jobs, anything to fund her escape. She didn't dream of luxury, just peace. A space of her own. Walls without Linda's judgment. Floors not ruled by footsteps that belonged to Cody. But for all her planning, she never imagined what would come crashing through her resolve 2 years later, that the very house she visited that fateful Christmas Eve, the one Gregory and Linda paraded as theirs, was supposed to be hers all along. Not just a home, an opportunity. A chance. A promise made by a grandfather who loved her in silence, while others claimed everything meant for her. And as she sat in that house uninvited but summoned her childhood shadows whispered from every corner. They hadn't just stolen a home. They had stolen years of belief in her own worth. And now the truth was about to break that silence wide open. Elena had always believed that education would be her way out. It wasn't just about books or degrees, it was her lifeline, her only chance to break free from the suffocating silence of her home life. So she had worked harder than most teenagers she knew. Late nights, reading, tutoring younger students for extra credit, submitting essays to statewide competitions, anything to build the kind of future no one in her house thought she deserved. When she found out about the Women in STEM scholarship, a full ride for underprivileged young women who showed academic promise, it felt like a sign. The application required transcripts, personal essays, and a signature from a parent or legal guardian to validate her residency and school records. She'd done everything else. The only thing missing was one signature. She waited 3 days before mustering the courage to approach Gregory, who was seated on the back porch nursing a glass of scotch, skimming through some insurance paperwork. Elena stepped out quietly, clutching the manila folder to her chest. "Dad," she said, voice tentative, "I need your signature for this scholarship. It's due tomorrow." Gregory didn't look up. "Scholarship." "Yes. It's a full ride. Engineering program in Chicago. I have everything ready. I just need your signature." His eyes flicked up at her, then brows furrowed. "Chicago. That's far." She nodded, hopeful. "It's a great school. I've been working on this for months." He looked back down, then handed the folder back without even opening it. "No." She blinked. I don't understand." "Cody needs us to focus right now," Gregory said flatly. "He's about to start at Parkview Academy. Tuition isn't cheap." Her voice trembled. "This doesn't cost you anything. It's a scholarship." Gregory stood up slowly, his glass in hand. "You want to leave home. And for what? Some degree Cody has real potential, Elena. He's the one we need to invest in." She felt like the air had been knocked out of her chest. "So, you're not signing," I said no. "Don't push it." He walked back inside, leaving her standing alone on the porch with the folder still unopened. That night she found the folder in the kitchen trash can. The papers had been torn cleanly in half. At first she thought maybe it had fallen accidentally, but the edges were too precise. As she reached in to retrieve it, she noticed a pale smear of lipstick on the top corner of the envelope, the same shade Linda always wore. She didn't confront her stepmother. There was no point. The message had already been made clear. By the time the scholarship deadline passed, Elena had exhausted every other option. She visited the school counselor, applied for community grants, begged her part-time boss at the library for any kind of reference that might help. But nothing came through. No funding, no future in Chicago. So instead of packing for college, she found herself applying for work at a 24-hour supermarket across town. She was hired within a week and started on night shifts, stacking shelves, managing inventory cleaning spills in aisle 5. The job wasn't hard, but the hours were brutal and the pay barely covered a one-room unit above a rundown auto shop on the edge of town. The walls were stained with years of smoke. The faucet leaked. Her only window faced a brick wall. Still, she never complained. At least it was hers. Meanwhile, Cody flourished. Gregory bought him a brand new black Jeep for his 18th birthday. Linda threw a party with catered food and hired a DJ. Neighbors gushed over what a fine young man Cody was becoming. He had just been accepted to Parkview Academy, a prestigious private school with dorms and weekend retreats. He didn't need a part-time job. He didn't even pack his own bags. Everything was done for him. Occasionally, Elena would run into one of Linda's friends in town. They always asked the same questions. "Still working at the grocery store, sweetie? When are you going back to school? You must be so proud of Cody." She'd smile, politely nod, and walk away. But inside the weight was growing. Not just from the injustice of it all, but from the quiet realization that she no longer expected anyone in her family to support her dreams. The betrayal was complete, and what hurt more than the missed scholarship was knowing that no one had fought for her, not even her father. One evening after a long shift, she returned to her apartment to find a note taped to her door. It was from her landlord reminding her that rent was due in 3 days. She sat on the floor back against the chipped paint, staring at her phone. Not a single message. No one had called to ask how she was doing. No one even seemed to notice she was gone. That was the moment she made herself a quiet vow. If she couldn't depend on anyone else to build a future, she would do it herself, brick by brick, $1 at a time. No shortcuts, no begging, no looking back. What she didn't know was that somewhere far from that dingy apartment, someone else had always intended something better for her. A promise made years ago, buried by deception, and waiting for the day it would finally come to light. 2 years before the Christmas dinner that would change everything, Elena Foster received a message that puzzled her. It came from her stepmother Linda, a woman who rarely acknowledged her existence outside of obligation. The message was brief, almost cold in tone, yet it contained something that piqued her curiosity. "Come by the house Saturday evening. We're having a small dinner. Dress nicely." There was no mention of what the dinner was for, and oddly enough, no explanation as to why it was being held at a completely unfamiliar address. Elena had never been told that her father and Linda had moved. She had still been living in the cramped apartment she rented near her workplace, scraping together rent each month by working long shifts at a local grocery store. Her last visit to their old home had been nearly a year prior, and she hadn't heard a single word about any plans to relocate. Still, something compelled her to go. Maybe it was the faint hope that things were changing, that after years of being pushed to the fringes, her family was finally reaching out with sincerity. Maybe in some corner of her heart, she still longed for their approval. She arrived early that evening in a modest dress and worn coat, her palms sweating slightly as she stared up at the impressive cream-colored house. It was nestled in a well-manicured neighborhood she had never set foot in. Wide porches, tall windows, trimmed hedges, it didn't resemble anything from her childhood. It looked like a dream someone else was living. When she rang the bell, Linda answered almost immediately. Her usual cold smile was replaced with a strangely warm one, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Elena." "You came," she said, ushering her in with a surprising tone of welcome. The inside was even more stunning. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, a grand chandelier. Family portraits already adorned the walls, including a large one by the staircase. Her father, Linda, Cody, and herself, all standing in front of the fireplace, smiling. Elena didn't remember taking that picture, but then it clicked. It must have been during some rare holiday visit. And beneath the photo was a silver plaque, "Our Forever Home, 2 years strong." She blinked at the words. 2 years. That couldn't be right. They'd lived here for 2 years, and no one had told her. Her name was on the invitation, and yet she felt like a guest, not a daughter. No one asked her how she'd been. Cody barely acknowledged her, glued to his phone. The dinner was casual but coordinated. Linda had made her signature roast, and a bottle of expensive red wine was already open. Elena noticed that she was seated at the far end of the table, almost like an afterthought, a guest invited to round out the numbers. Still, something gnawed at her. The warmth in Linda's voice. The photo. The sudden desire to capture another family picture that evening. "Let's get everyone together," Linda had said cheerfully. "One for Grandpa's album." It was strange Linda never used to care about group photos. In fact, Elena couldn't remember a single framed photo from her teenage years where she was centered. She was always in the background, cropped at the edge. And yet that night they posed like a happy family. Elena stood stiffly beside her father, Linda's arm resting lightly on her shoulder. Cody grinning without a care. The camera clicked. Then another. "Perfect," Linda said, nodding toward her husband. "Let's print this and send it to your father. He'll be thrilled to see we're all happy here." Something about that sentence made Elena's stomach churn. Happy here? The unease followed her for days. She tried to brush it off, chalk it up to her own discomfort in being around people who had never truly welcomed her. But the phrase, 2 years strong, kept looping in her mind. The timeline didn't make sense. Why hadn't she known about the move? And why were they so intent on capturing this image of unity and joy? It wasn't until later, much later, that the truth unraveled. The photo, the dinner, the warm smiles, they weren't meant for her. They were for her grandfather, Walter. A man she had met only a few times as a child, but who had, unknown to her, quietly sent money to her father over the years. Money meant to ensure she had a safe and secure life. 2 years ago, Walter had sent a large sum to Gregory with one purpose: to buy Elena a house to give her a fresh start after she turned 21. The house she now sat in as a guest, not a resident. The picture was proof. A fabricated piece of evidence mailed to Walter to confirm that Elena was indeed living in the home he'd provided for her. A lie wrapped in ribbon propped up by a single photograph and a perfectly staged dinner. Elena had unknowingly played her part in the deception. And Linda, sweet smiling Linda, had orchestrated the performance like a seasoned director. In hindsight, it all made sense. The sudden invitation, the coordinated friendliness, the way her presence was barely tolerated but strategically included. It had never been about welcoming her back into the family. It was about maintaining a lie. And for 2 years that lie had stood unquestioned until the night Walter came to dinner himself and asked a question no one had prepared for. That night hadn't happened yet. But the foundation of betrayal had already been laid. The house she had briefly stepped into as a visitor was never meant for her to leave. It had always been hers. They had just stolen it first. The silence that followed Elena's quiet confession was suffocating. Forks hung mid-air, glasses remained untouched, and even the crackling fireplace seemed to hush itself as everyone stared at her. She had looked her grandfather in the eyes and said the one sentence that fractured the evening beyond repair. "I've never received a house from you, Grandpa." Walter Foster. A man known in business circles for his composure slowly set down his wine glass, his jaw tightening. He looked around the room from Elena, pale but steady, to Gregory and Linda, who sat frozen, their smiles having vanished like breath in winter air. "You never received the house?" Walter asked again, his voice low, deliberate. Elena shook her head. "No. I've been renting a tiny apartment on my own. I work night shifts to afford it." The words pierced the air like ice. Gregory's eyes darted toward Linda, who stiffened in her seat. Cody looked down at his plate, suddenly finding his mashed potatoes more interesting than the conversation unfolding. Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. "Gregory, 2 years ago I wired you $400,000. That money was for a house. For Elena. I made it clear to you. I even sent the property recommendations myself." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She felt dizzy, unsure whether she'd heard correctly. $400,000? A house for her? Gregory swallowed. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Dad, I thought it would be best for the family if we used that money together. A shared home. Elena, she's independent. She doesn't need much." Linda finally spoke, her tone sharp and bitter. "She's not even my daughter. Why should she get an entire house handed to her while Cody has to—" "Enough." Walter snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The dishes rattled, the chandelier above gave a faint tremble, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his fury. He rose slowly from his seat and pointed to the photo hanging above the fireplace, the one Linda had proudly shown guests earlier that evening. It depicted a seemingly happy family, arms linked, all smiling. Elena had been awkwardly wedged at the far edge, as though digitally added last minute. "That picture," Walter growled. "You used that photo to deceive me. You've been sending updates making it seem like she was living here, enjoying the life I tried to give her." Gregory's lips trembled, his face drained of color. Walter turned back to Elena, his voice softer now, but weighted with pain. "Every year I also sent money for your tuition, college savings, living expenses. I wanted you to have options to study without worry. Did you receive any of it?" Elena shook her head again, her throat tight. "No, I didn't even know about it." Gregory attempted to interject, but Walter cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't. I trusted you. I believed you were honoring Diana's memory. She was my daughter, your wife. And this is what you've done to her child." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she blinked them back. The revelations dropped like anvils. All those years of scrimping, working late shifts, skipping meals to save while the support that was meant for her had been stolen and repurposed to build someone else's life. Linda crossed her arms, muttering, "Cody deserves every bit of what we gave him. He's our future." Walter stared at her expressionless, then turned his back to both her and Gregory. "Elena," he said clearly, "you're coming with me tonight. This house, it's yours. It always was. I'll make sure it's transferred properly. And Gregory," he paused, glancing once more at his son, "we'll be speaking again through lawyers." Gregory's shoulders slumped in defeat. Cody remained silent. Linda didn't move. Elena sat motionless, absorbing it all. She didn't speak not because she was afraid, but because she couldn't find words large enough to contain the heartbreak and betrayal. Her entire life, the cold rooms, the missing birthdays, the ignored achievements, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. Not neglect by accident, but by design. Walter stepped behind her chair and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go, sweetheart." She rose slowly, her hands trembling. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back once more at the people who had called themselves family. But she saw only strangers. And for the first time in her life, she was walking away from them with her head held high, not as a forgotten girl in the shadows, but as someone who had just stepped into the light. Elena sat quietly in the back seat of her grandfather's SUV, her eyes still red from holding back the flood of emotion that had built up during the Christmas dinner that had started like any other and ended with her entire life unraveling in front of her. The city lights of Ohio slowly faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of highway and the distant hum of the tires on the cold asphalt. She hadn't said much since she stepped out of that house. The house she had just learned was supposed to be hers. The house that had been stolen from her without her knowing it. Walter Foster, her maternal grandfather, sat beside her, his tall frame wrapped in a long black overcoat. He looked out the window for a moment before turning toward her. "You don't have to talk now," he said, voice calm and steady. "We'll have time. Let's just get you home first." Home. That word had never really meant anything to Elena. It had always been tied to duty, coldness, and silence. But when the gates of Walter's Chicago estate slowly opened just before dawn, she began to wonder if that word might finally carry meaning. The mansion wasn't just large, it was beautiful in a timeless way, with ivy creeping along its stone facade and warm golden lights glowing through the windows. A staff greeted them softly, but Walter waved them off, not wanting to overwhelm her. "Let her rest," he said simply. The room she was given looked like something from a magazine. A thick comforter was draped across a four-poster bed, and an antique desk sat beside a bay window that overlooked the frozen garden. Elena stood motionless in the doorway, gripping the strap of her worn-out backpack. Walter placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is your room now. You don't need to ask. You don't need to earn it. You deserve it because you're my granddaughter. And Diana's daughter." Hearing her mother's name spoken so gently made Elena's eyes sting. No one had talked about Diana in years, as if her existence had been erased along with everything else that made Elena feel real. Walter looked down, his voice growing heavy. "I should have come sooner. I tried. You need to know that. When you were 6, I flew out to visit. I brought a stuffed bear and a box of books your mother loved as a girl." Elena slowly sat on the bed, eyes locked on his. "But when I showed up, Gregory told me you weren't home. Then later he sent a letter saying you weren't well, that you had psychological issues, that it would be best if I stayed away." His jaw clenched. "I didn't believe him at first, but I thought maybe I'd only make things worse by forcing myself into your life. I regret that now more than anything." Elena looked down at her hands. Her father hadn't just stolen her money and her future. He had stolen her family, her mother's memory, and the only person who had ever stood a chance of truly loving her. Walter sat beside her. "You don't have to explain. I know it's been hard, but from this moment on, I promise you no more closed doors." The next morning, they went to a quiet university campus on the edge of Chicago. Winter had blanketed the city in white, and Elena wore a scarf Walter had lent her, still too stunned by everything to say much. At the admissions office, he sat beside her, helping her fill out every form, answering questions when she grew nervous, and speaking with a calm authority that reminded her this wasn't just kindness, it was a second chance deliberately given. As they left the building, a folder of documents in her hands, Walter turned to her and said, "You're back on track, and I'll be with you all the way." Later that night, as Elena sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea wrapped in a thick throw blanket, she felt a quiet warmth she couldn't quite name. This house wasn't loud or cold. There were no glances of judgment, no backhanded comments. Only space, gentle voices, safety. For the first time in her life, she wasn't calculating how to make herself smaller or more acceptable. She wasn't wondering what she'd done wrong. She was simply existing and being loved for it. She whispered almost to herself, "Maybe I'm not a burden. Maybe I never was." Walter, sitting across from her reading the paper, looked up at her and smiled as if he'd heard. "No, Elena, you were never the problem. You were just never given a chance to bloom." That night, as she lay in the soft bed that wasn't creaky or cold, Elena stared at the ceiling, not in fear, but in wonder. What would it feel like to dream without limits? She didn't know yet. But in the silence of that grand old house, one thing was certain: the door to the life she'd always been denied had finally opened. By the time spring came to Chicago, Elena had started to feel something she hadn't in years, a quiet sense of direction. The cold nights of winter had passed, but their lessons lingered. In the warmth of her grandfather's home, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new, something that belonged only to her. Her days had become structured in a way that felt grounding rather than suffocating. She had enrolled in a civil engineering program at a nearby university, her class schedule carefully arranged around a new role as a junior assistant at Walter Foster & Co., the construction firm her grandfather had built from the ground up decades earlier. It wasn't a symbolic job. Walter made that clear. If you're going to build, you need to understand the foundation, he told her on her first day, handing her a hard hat and a neatly printed employee badge. The office was housed in a restored warehouse overlooking the river, its brick walls lined with architectural blueprints and models of previous projects. Elena spent her mornings reviewing drafts, attending safety meetings, and shadowing engineers on site. It was a world far removed from supermarket shelves and flickering fluorescent lights. It was loud, gritty, precise, and she loved it. That was also where she met Emily. Emily Carlson had been hired around the same time Elena started. She was a few years older, warm in a way that disarmed without trying, and seemed to possess a kind of instinctual understanding of people who carried invisible wounds. On Elena's third day, she offered her half a muffin and said, "You looked like you forgot breakfast again." From that moment on, a quiet friendship took root. Emily never pried, but she listened. During lunch breaks, they shared stories not just about work, but about growing up, family, and everything in between. When Elena finally shared fragments of her past, the coldness, the stolen house, the nights spent wondering if she mattered, Emily didn't react with pity. She simply nodded and said, "I know what that kind of silence feels like." It was Emily who encouraged her to join a local support group for women who had experienced psychological and emotional abuse within families. The group met twice a month in the basement of a library, where women sat in a circle with tea and tissues, offering stories without judgment. At first, Elena was hesitant. Her pain felt too tangled, too private. But after her second meeting, she brought a notebook with her. By the fourth, she began writing in it every day. She didn't call it a journal, not at first. It was just a place to put the noise, the things she had never said aloud. But over time, the notebook grew into something more. A record not just of what had been taken from her, but of everything she was reclaiming. Each page was a brick in the foundation of her new life. Each word a step away from the silence of her past. Walter noticed the change in her, though he never said much. Instead, he gave her space and opportunities. One afternoon, after reviewing a stack of permit proposals, he slid a folder across her desk. "It's a small municipal park project," he said. "Not glamorous, but it's yours. You'll coordinate the teams, manage the timeline. I'll be here if you need backup, but I trust your instincts." Elena opened the folder and stared at the plans. It was a modest job, a walking trail, some benches, a playground layout, but it felt monumental. Not because of its scale, but because someone had trusted her to lead. She worked on it tirelessly for weeks, balancing her classes and late-night edits. Emily helped where she could, offering feedback and moral support. Walter occasionally dropped in with suggestions, but never hovered. When the project finally broke ground, Elena stood on the site as the first truck arrived, the cold wind snapping at her coat. For the first time, she wasn't just standing on someone else's path, she was shaping her own. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Today I gave a team their first instructions. They listened. I didn't stutter. I didn't shrink. I belonged there." It wasn't just the job. It was the small things, too. Like learning to cook meals she liked, not just what was convenient. Like buying a new winter coat with her own money. Like answering the phone when Walter called, not with hesitation, but with ease. Bit by bit, Elena was discovering who she might have been all along had she been nurtured instead of neglected. The brokenness didn't vanish, but it stopped defining her. Her voice, once quiet and uncertain now, carried weight in meetings. Her eyes, once trained to scan for exits, now looked forward with purpose. Chicago wasn't where she was born, but it had become the place she was reborn. And in the quiet moments between concrete and steel, Elena finally began to believe in the life she was building, not the one others tried to take from her, but the one she was claiming for herself. By the time summer arrived, Elena had nearly completed her first year in the civil engineering program. Her mornings were spent at job sites or in class, and her evenings at her desk reviewing measurements or journaling the progress she had made not just academically, but emotionally. Her life now had rhythm, stability, and a quiet sense of purpose. She no longer wondered where she belonged. She had carved out her place. News of what happened to the rest of the Foster family came not through gossip or confrontation, but gradually through whispers at work, distant relatives reaching out on social media, and the occasional overheard conversation at church or in town. Elena never asked. She didn't need to. But the truth, like most things, found its way to her anyway. Gregory's downfall began slowly, but when it came hard. When Walter had discovered the full extent of his son's betrayal, he didn't react with threats or shouting. He simply acted. The financial ties were cut overnight. Accounts frozen. Business connections severed. Gregory had built his career largely on the shadow of his father's name. Without it, his reputation crumbled. Clients pulled contracts, colleagues distanced themselves, and whispers of dishonesty and mismanagement began to circulate in professional circles. Within months, he was forced out of his firm. His former partners released a statement citing ethical disagreements, and local news picked up the story painting him as the man who had stolen from his own daughter. It didn't take long for the industry to close its doors to him completely. Gregory, once a man of status and suits, now found himself sitting in employment offices, submitting resumes to people half his age, waiting for callbacks that never came. Linda, too, saw her carefully curated image unravel. After years of posturing as a lifestyle entrepreneur, she had attempted to launch a boutique business, an online store selling home decor, skincare, and hand-lettered mugs with inspirational quotes. But without Gregory's income and Walter's silent financial support, her capital vanished. Orders went unfulfilled, her customer service was flooded with complaints, and soon enough she found herself the subject of local online forums criticizing her scam shop and fake influencer personality. The same neighbors who once admired her Thanksgiving spreads and designer handbags now rolled their eyes when her name came up. Linda, once so invested in appearances, couldn't stand the slow erosion of social validation. Cody, who had never known struggle, responded to the family's downfall with bitterness and blame. After flunking out of Parkview Academy, an outcome no one had expected him to even reach, given how little he applied himself, he bounced between temporary jobs, none lasting more than a few weeks. He was frequently late, often distracted, and openly disrespectful to supervisors. Employers didn't put up with his entitlement for long. After being fired for the third time in 6 months, he stopped trying altogether. He stayed home, played video games, and picked fights with Linda and Gregory, insisting they had ruined his future. Eventually, the savings ran out. Debts piled up. Creditors began calling. With no income and no help, they were forced to sell furniture, electronics, even the car. They clung to the illusion of dignity for as long as they could, until the eviction notice arrived and there was nothing left to pretend about. The elegant house, the one Walter had intended for Elena, was sold under Elena's name once Walter transferred it back to its rightful owner. The proceeds went directly to her university account, covering not just tuition, but housing and books for the next 3 years. Elena signed the final paperwork at her grandfather's law office, her signature calm, precise, and final. She never mentioned the house to anyone. Not her classmates, not her professors, not even Emily. She didn't need to. That chapter, like the people who had occupied it, had no place in her future. Not once did she reach out to Gregory, Linda, or Cody. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some ties once severed should never be retied. The Foster family moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, barely more than 2 rooms in a gray, aging building. The neighborhood was loud, the heat unreliable, and the landlord indifferent. There was no dining room, no fireplace, no framed family portraits, just peeling paint, overdue bills, and the weight of choices that could no longer be undone. Elena didn't rejoice in their fall. She didn't smile at their suffering. In truth, she barely thought about them at all. Her world had moved on, and so had she. Some betrayals destroy what's around them. Others, like the one she endured, carve out something new. A space for healing. A reason to grow. Elena didn't look back, not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer defined her. And in the quiet of her new life, filled with study design and slow, steady joy, she found something Gregory, Linda, and Cody never could. Peace. The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no return address. Elena found it in the stack of mail on the front table, sandwiched between a utility bill and a university newsletter. Her name was written in neat, unfamiliar script, formal, careful as though someone had taken extra time to make sure it looked sincere. She didn't open it right away. She carried it to her desk, placed it beside her laptop, and stared at it for a long while. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing wet leaves against the window. Inside, the air was still. She'd gone months without hearing a word from Gregory. No calls, no texts, no sudden appearances. Just silence. And now this. When she finally unfolded the paper, she saw the letter was typed, not handwritten. That alone told her more than the words that followed. Elena, it began. There are no words that can erase the pain I caused you. I failed you as a father. I allowed pride, fear, and my own weakness to guide my actions, and in doing so, I hurt you in ways I can never undo. I took from you not just a home, but years of opportunity, stability, and trust. I will live with that guilt for the rest of my life. The letter continued for 2 full pages. It spoke of regret, of wishing things had been different, of hoping she could one day find it in her heart to forgive him. It ended with, "I am truly sorry, and I hope this is the first step toward healing." There was no emotion in the paper, no familiar turns of phrase, no personal references, no mention of her mother, of the times he had refused to attend her school events, or the nights she cried herself to sleep after being told she was a burden. Just vague words, well constructed and distant. It read like something written by someone who had never met her. Elena folded it back along its original crease. She placed it gently on the desk, then pulled out her laptop. Out of curiosity, she searched one of the more distinct sentences. Within seconds, dozens of similar apology templates appeared written by legal professionals for use in family settlements, estate disputes, and pre-litigation negotiations. She wasn't surprised. Disappointed maybe, but not surprised. This wasn't a heartfelt confession. It was a calculated gesture likely drafted by Gregory's attorney to show good faith, perhaps to soften Walter's stance, or minimize the risk of formal legal action. A paper shield. She stared at the blinking cursor on her screen for a while before composing her response. She didn't rage or pour out the truth. She didn't relive every slight, every stolen moment. She didn't demand justice or repayment. There was nothing she needed from Gregory anymore. She typed only one sentence. "I wish things had been different." She printed it, signed it, and placed it in an envelope without a return address, just as his had come. She dropped it in the mailbox before dinner and didn't think about it again. That night she wrote in her journal. Not about Gregory, but about her current project, a new urban community park. She was designing a walking trail with accessible features for all ages. She wanted it to feel open, safe, a place where people could breathe. It wasn't that she had forgiven him. Forgiveness, she had come to learn, wasn't something you owed someone just because they asked. And it certainly wasn't something earned through a legal draft. But neither was she holding on to the pain. Not anymore. What Gregory had done was real. It had shaped her, hurt her, and nearly destroyed her belief in love and family. But it no longer controlled her. She didn't need his remorse to move forward. She had built something stronger than resentment, peace. As the rain continued to fall outside, Elena closed her journal and turned off her desk lamp. The letter sat in a drawer, now filed away not as a keepsake, but as a record. A final note in a chapter she no longer needed to reread. She didn't hate him, but she would never return to him. And that was enough. The call came just after 7:30 on a quiet Monday evening. Elena was finishing edits on a structural report when her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen in over a year. For a moment she considered ignoring it. But something made her pick up. It was Linda. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now trembled on the other end of the line. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Elena," she said, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to ask you for help. It's about Cody." Elena's hand tightened slightly around her pen, but her voice remained even. "Go on. He's not doing well. He hasn't been able to find work. No one will hire him. He barely eats. He doesn't get out of bed some days." Linda hesitated before continuing. "I think he's depressed. Really depressed. And we're out of money. We can't afford therapy or even groceries some weeks. I thought maybe you could talk to your grandfather, or even help us a little yourself." Elena stared out the window at the soft glow of the city lights. She could hear Linda's quiet crying now, the kind that came not just from worry, but from desperation. But Elena didn't feel the same old sting of rejection or the pull of guilt. She felt clarity. "Linda," she said calmly, "I know what it feels like to be alone, to have nothing, to be told you're not worth helping. I lived that for 20 years. But I got up. I worked. I studied. I fought for every inch of the life I have now." She paused. "If Cody wants a better future, he'll have to fight for it too. Just like I did." Linda didn't reply immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying," Elena replied, "I'm not your solution. And I was never your problem." She ended the call without anger. Just finality. Later that week, while reading an editorial about generational trauma and healing, Elena was struck by the idea of telling her story not to expose anyone, but to reach those who had once felt invisible like she had. She spent days writing and rewriting her words. She left out names, places, and specifics, but the truth rang through every paragraph. She titled it, "Growing Up Unwanted." In it, she described what it felt like to be the child who wasn't celebrated, whose birthdays went unnoticed, whose academic success was ignored in favor of a sibling's mediocrity. She shared how silence can bruise more deeply than words, and how survival sometimes comes down to one unshakable belief that you deserve more than what the world gives you. She submitted it anonymously to the editorial section of a well-read local paper. It ran the following Sunday. The response was immediate. Readers wrote in sharing their own experiences. Therapists referenced it in local support groups. Social workers printed it out and brought it to client meetings. Radio shows quoted it. The newspaper's online version saw tens of thousands of shares in just 2 days. But something else happened too. Something Elena hadn't planned. People recognized the story, the timing, the details, the past connections. Whispers began in town, especially among those who had once worked with Gregory Foster, dined with Linda at charity luncheons, or heard her boast about Cody's promising future. The truth, even without names, had a way of revealing itself. By the end of the week, Gregory received a formal letter from the last remaining board he sat on. His membership had been rescinded. Sponsors pulled out of a small speaking event he'd been scheduled to lead at a local college. Linda's name became a punchline in online parenting forums. And Cody. Every job interview ended the same way: polite rejection or no call back at all. One employer, when pressed by a friend of the family, reportedly said, "We don't need that kind of drama. The Foster name is too loaded now." Elena heard about all this secondhand. She didn't seek out the stories, but people brought them to her, assuming she'd want to know. She nodded politely, then turned the conversation elsewhere. It wasn't joy she felt, not satisfaction. What she felt was something deeper. Closure. Justice hadn't come in the form of lawsuits or public takedowns. It had arrived quietly, like the change of seasons. Not as revenge, but as realignment. The world had tilted back toward truth. Not perfectly, but enough. She returned to her life, her studies, her projects. She continued working with women in support groups, helping them find language for their own hurt. And sometimes, when no one was looking, she would reread her published article, not to relive the pain, but to remind herself how far she had come. Elena had found peace not by punishing those who wronged her, but by refusing to be defined by their actions. Their downfall had never been her goal, but their actions had caught up with them anyway. In the end, she didn't need to lift a finger to bring justice. She only had to rise. Elena graduated from her second year with distinction. Her professors described her as focused, thoughtful, and relentlessly dedicated, qualities that didn't always show up on paper, but revealed themselves in every blueprint she submitted, every site inspection she led, and every late-night study session she quietly completed long after the others had packed up. It wasn't just that she was a top student, it was the way she carried herself now. Calm, unapologetic, rooted. Word of her work ethic reached the upper levels of her grandfather's company, and by the end of summer she was officially promoted to project manager on a mid-scale civic renovation. She accepted the offer with the same quiet grace she had brought to every success, not as a reward for surviving the past, but as a natural continuation of who she had always been, finally given the space to emerge. With her own savings and Walter's continued emotional support, but no longer financial, Elena purchased a modest but beautiful apartment on the city's north side. It wasn't large, but it had everything she needed: warm lighting, quiet walls, a small balcony where she could drink tea and watch the skyline stretch into dusk. She decorated it with intention, surrounding herself not with things she thought others would admire, but with pieces that made her feel safe, seen, and whole. A stack of architecture books by the window, a single photograph of her as a child holding a crayon drawing with a shy smile. And on her nightstand, the notebook she had once filled with pain, now closed, but never discarded. One rainy afternoon, while unpacking an old storage box from Walter's attic, she found a small leather-bound journal wrapped in a silk scarf. She recognized the handwriting immediately: delicate, slanted with small loops and thoughtful spacing. Her mother's. She had never seen it before. Walter hadn't known it was there. Diana must have left it behind years ago. Elena held the book gently, almost afraid to open it. But when she did, the pages met her fingers like an embrace. Thoughts about pregnancy, names she'd considered, her fears, her hopes. And in the final section, a line written in ink that had only barely faded with time: "Grow into a woman who walks alone, but never lonely." Elena sat for a long while, pressing her hand over the words, as if trying to absorb them into her skin. Her mother had never had the chance to raise her. But somehow, through this journal, she had still managed to leave a map. A blessing. A quiet push forward. Later that week, Elena drove out of the city toward the quiet hillside cemetery where her mother was buried. She hadn't been there in years. The stone was simple, weathered by time and rain. She laid a bouquet of lilies, her mother's favorite, according to Walter, at the base, and knelt down to leave a small card beneath the flowers. She whispered the words as she placed it there. "You were the light. I never met, but I carry it forward every day." There were no tears, just peace. Months passed. Elena continued her work, but another calling began to stir, one that went beyond steel and soil. With encouragement from Emily and others at the support group, she began to write not just journals now, but structured stories, narratives, essays, and eventually a book. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly. It was part reflection, part guide, and part invitation. A way to speak to those still sitting in dark rooms, wondering if they mattered. Her book, The Woman Who Stayed Standing, was published quietly, but found its way into more hands than she expected. Invitations followed: libraries, women's shelters, university panels. At first, she was nervous. She didn't see herself as a speaker. But every time she stood behind a microphone and saw the faces in front of her faces that looked like her once. She knew the words mattered. Not because they condemned, but because they showed a way through. She never spoke Gregory's name, never mentioned Linda or Cody. That wasn't the point. The point was that pain could become purpose. That silence could be broken not with vengeance, but with voice. And in every speech, every chapter, every conversation with someone who said, "I thought I was alone until I heard your story," she was reminded she had already won. Not by taking anything from those who had tried to break her, but by becoming someone they never imagined she could be. Elena no longer lived to prove herself. She no longer needed to reclaim what was stolen. She had built something better, from the ground up, stronger than steel, wiser than bitterness. She didn't need permission. She didn't need revenge. She was enough, and she always had been. Thank you for staying with Elena until the very end of her story. Through years of silence, neglect, and betrayal, she chose not to harden her heart, but to rise, to heal, and to become the kind of woman her younger self needed. Her story isn't just about pain. It's about rebuilding, about choosing peace over revenge, about discovering that sometimes the most powerful kind of justice is living well and loving yourself enough to let go. If Elena's journey moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of her story touched you the most? Have you ever had to walk away from a past that tried to define you? Leave a comment below. We read every one of them. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, stories of resilience, family, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices like Elena's into the light. Because in the end, we all deserve to be reminded we are enough, just as we are.